Hey everybody, it's Jason again from the Children's Museum of Houston. I run the ASTEAM program, so this is a video right now that we're going to do about forensic science. Now, unlike most videos that I've done so far in this series, I want to give you a good background of forensic science on its own before we get to any activities. It hasn't been around that long, forensic science. A lot of people will probably think like it's been around since we started detecting crimes and whatnot, but it hasn't been. For the longest time, the way we sort of figured out who was a criminal is we use eyewitness accounts, something called circumstantial evidence. What we're trying to do nowadays is match circumstantial evidence with a much better type of evidence, which is scientific evidence. Being a science guy, you know that this is something I feel very strongly about. In fact, I think circumstantial evidence should just go away. Anything that's scientific is what counts, okay? You have probably seen a lot of TV shows that talk about forensic science, the scientific evidence of crime solving. You've probably seen CSI, Bones, all these different kinds of shows. And what's really cool about those shows is they actually let people know just how many different types of scientists work in forensic science. You have chemists, very obvious thing. They look at the chemistry of certain materials left behind at a crime scene. You have biologists. You have entomologists, people who study insects. Sometimes an insect that doesn't belong in a certain place will be found at a crime scene, and that lets people know, wait a minute, this person could have been from the only place this insect originates from. So different types of scientists are called in to actually figure out how to solve a certain crime. We look at DNA, we look at hair follicles, we look at skin grafts, we look at tire tracks that were left behind. All these different things to get enough evidence to support a case. Now that's something that's really important to understand. A lot of ways in which forensic science works is actually to not get innocent people even on trial. It's to actually narrow it down to a single person or a few people to actually put on the trial. And then once it's in the trial part of the justice system, then it's up to 12 people to decide whether or not the scientific evidence is enough to convict. Now, like I said, forensic science hasn't been around very long. In the mid to late 1800s in France, a lot of forensic science began using fingerprints, your fingers. Scientists realized that no one's fingerprint is exactly the same. And so when they started to think these things out, they started taking people's fingerprints in order to match a single person to a single crime. There was also another method called the Bertillon method, and that was a way of measuring a person's body parts, like their arms and their hands, their feet, their thighs, all their different body parts to see if they were a certain height, if they were a certain girth, in order to match them to some of the evidence of the crime of where they might have been standing, how they might have been doing the crime, if they could have reached something, things like that. These methods at first were very controversial. Nowadays we hear about fingerprints and everyone's like, oh yeah, fingerprints, that's what we all do. But at the beginning it was very controversial because the scientific part of it was still in its infancy. So it took a long time for people to actually finally accept this idea of scientific evidence. It's very important to understand that back then, circumstantial evidence was something that we used a lot when going to trial. And the problem with circumstantial evidence is this. It's basically eyewitness accounts. It's someone saying, I saw this person at the crime scene, so they must have done it. Now, what are the problems with that? Well, that person might just not like that person. That person might have had a reputation of doing crimes in the past, but might have totally rehabilitated themselves. So the scientific evidence in France is what really started this forensic science idea. And this fingerprinting evidence is what really started this forensic science idea. And now it's just grown to so many different sciences that if you put scientific evidence correctly on trial, it's very hard to dispute it. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ways in which we can use scientific evidence to place people or one person at a particular crime. Now, this is a made-up crime. This is something that we just put together to give you an idea of how you can do this. The crime is happening here at the Children's Museum of Houston, and some of the people who work at the Children's Museum of Houston are going to be the suspects. I'll explain all that later when we talk about our first activity, but for now, I just really want you to understand that forensic science is something that's very important in the justice system, especially today. And it's pretty cool to me to be able to present forensic science because this is what I studied in school. I was a developmental psychologist, but I also studied aberrant behavior to understand, like, basically, if you had problems when you were a child in your development, would you more likely become a criminal? And because of that aspect of my work, I actually did forensic science. So I really, really enjoy this. So hopefully you'll see that enjoyment when I talk about the different activities, and hopefully you'll find yourself enjoying this kind of work as much as I do. Give us a few minutes, we're gonna get our first activity together. You can go ahead and look at that video, but really this is important that you understand forensic science is scientific evidence of criminology.